Welcome to the Harber Show. This is part one of our special two-part series with Philip Anschutz, talking about his book, Out Where the West Begins. Phil, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Aaron.
Really appreciate it.
Nice of you to invite me.
All right, well, first I want to know, where did you find time to write a book? I mean, the number of companies you run and no one can keep track of. How did you do that?
We've all got extra time in our lives. It's just simply a matter of managing it. I'm sure you know all about that.
Well, I don't get any sleep. That's my secret.
Well, I could probably get more sleep, but there's always time to do the things that are important.
Well, and tell me about just the whole beginning of this. When did it occur to you? When did you start thinking about doing this?
Well, this really goes back to my childhood, I think. My mother was a school teacher. She placed great value on teaching, and especially on music and books and history. And she developed an early interest, I think, for me, and I pursued it. We'd visit museums and go to concerts, and all of us as parents try and do that with our children, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I'm here to tell you, occasionally it works.
I can't make the same claim, by the way.
Well, apparently, some of that rubbed off on me. So my interest in history started very early. And then, for probably the last 35 or 40 years, doing a book on the West has been on my list of things to do, and for one reason or another, I just never quite got around to it, although I had written this book in my head many times. And I'd written notes to myself, I'd read the biographies, I knew most of the people that are in the book, I knew their histories because I like biographies.
Well, you mentioned, by the way, 30 or 40 years ago, when we first met, it was at a charity race, and it was something like 33 years ago.
You have a good history.
I had my guide dog puppy from Guide Dogs for the Blind, Hector, and I'm standing next to you and Nancy. Didn't know either of you, and you were kind enough to introduce yourself, probably because you were interested in the dog. And I think we ran a mile together. So about this same time, you were already thinking about the book. That's pretty amazing. Well, tell me in terms of picking the characters. Tell me about that process a little bit. I'm really interested in that.
Well, let me tell you first how I decided to set the book up and the time period, because I had to have some stakes in the ground, or the list of people and the book would have been endless in numbers of pages. So I had to find a way to cut it down. So I decided to pick the time frame 1800 to 1924, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And so many people have been involved in the West, in the exploration and the development in various ways. But I had to pick a number of people, and then I had to pick from, what was it they did. So I decided it should be about business people, and I can tell you why in a moment. But so that's how I managed to scope the book in terms of getting it down to a reasonable length.
But even 1 1/4 centuries that's a long period of time, and especially for the American West during that time. I mean, the American West in 1800 versus the American West in 1920 or 1924, dramatically different.
Absolutely, and in 1800, remember that almost nothing was known by almost anyone west of the Mississippi River. East of the Mississippi River, a lot was known. There was a lot of history, but going west, frankly, very few people had ever gone west. and it was unknown territory, and by the way, in many respects, it wasn't friendly territory.
And it wasn't even all U.S. territory.
No, it wasn't. It was simply still being contested. Keep in mind that this was a small moment in time, but America, as we knew it at that time, was surrounded by 4 very large powers: Spain, the English, France, and Russia. Very large countries. They all had standing armies. They all had their eyes upon the prize of this new country of ours. But something happened. And you know what that was? It was Napoleon primarily. All 4 of those countries were tied down in a land war during this time period. So I picked 1800 to 1920. And as I said, almost nothing was known at that time. But 120 years later, now just think of this, Aaron, 120 years later, a mere blink of the eye in historical terms, the area going west from the Mississippi was the 4th or 5th largest industrial power in the world, from nothing. Now, I'm not talking about the whole United States. I'm talking about the area just west of the Mississippi.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It had transformed into one of the largest industrial powers in the world.
Well, one of the really startling sets of numbers that I noticed in the book was the population of Los Angeles in that era, and the idea that San Francisco was literally 20 times bigger than Los Angeles, even when Los Angeles had a reasonable number of people. And you think of LA now, or even Los Angeles 50 years ago, this extraordinary growth at a time when some of the times when you were writing about it, there's 1,200 people or 5,000 people who live in that area.
Well,
I don't think anyone could imagine that.
well, that's true, but turn the clock back just a few more years, there weren't any cities, there weren't any towns, there weren't any settlements. And 120 years later, look what happened. And you had people, individuals in this book, that went far beyond establishing businesses or creating new industries. You had people that established towns and cities, sometimes developed whole parts of the country, like Brigham Young as an example, went far beyond business.
William
Great
Palmer,
railroad barons, General Palmer. He probably was responsible for about 1,000 towns, and they became cities by himself. The railroads, when they came, people followed, civilization followed, towns followed. So it's fascinating the lives these individuals led and what they were able to do. And you wonder, how did that happen? How were they able to do that? Which was one of the reasons I did this book. There were 2 great themes. What happened? How could it have happened? And the second theme, I guess a secondary in importance as well, was how was the popular image of the West, the ones, the image you and I probably have, and probably a lot of your viewers have, of the American West. Where'd that come from? How was that developed? Who did that?
And how intentional was it? We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with Philip Anschutz in just a moment.
I didn't pick the individuals for this book based on whether or not they would be good role models. I picked them because of their abilities to create positive change and long-term strategies for industries or businesses that would survive and change the American West.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
Hi, I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Because I've never done endorsements or commercials, people ask how are our programs funded, especially because we provide them as a public service to all our broadcast outlets. It's expensive to produce our show, whether we do them here in Denver or go to places such as Aspen, Washington, D.C., or even Iraq. The answer is we depend on contributions to support our work to bring you some of the nation's top opinion leaders. Individuals, businesses, foundations, and other nonprofits make tax-deductible contributions to the Democracy and Media Education Foundation to help allow us to continue to work for you. To find out more or to make a donation, just go to dmefd.org. The DMEF is a tax-exempt public charitable organization and has promised to dedicate 100% of every contribution to support our public affairs initiatives. If you believe, as I do, in the need for a forum which promotes civil discourse and mutually respectful discussion, I hope you'll decide to make a contribution today.
Join me and watch the Aaron Harber Show.
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 I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Aaron Harber Show and keep hope alive.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at www.harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. We're talking about Out Where the West Begins. You can see on your screen how to purchase the book if you'd like to read it. Phil, tell me about some of your favorite characters in the book. And but first, I want how did you limit it? I mean, you have a lot, but there are many others you could have included. How did you make that weeding out decision?
Well, obviously there were a lot of people that were candidates, and probably in the opinion of some who read the book, some that were not so obvious as candidates and possibly might not have really belonged in the book. But what I wanted to convey is who built the lasting companies that changed long-term the future of the West. I mean, railroads is a great example. Banking and finance would be another. Communication, farming, agriculture. But some, as an example, when I say are not well known, you probably know who Charles Goodnight was.
Sure.
But I'll bet a lot of your viewers don't.
I didn't know who Jay Cook was.
Okay. That would be another. Theodore Judah would be one. And let's talk about Charles Goodnight, because he's an interesting character. The reason I put him in the book, he made a real contribution to the cattle industry and agriculture in the American West. Very early contribution. And it affected long-term how those businesses and industries grew. That was one of the requirements that I wanted when I picked individuals. It might interest you to know that the fellow that wrote Lonesome Dove, have you seen the movie? Have you read the book?
Sure.
If you remember Captain Call, remember a Texas Ranger, and a very tough guy, uneducated, had no formal education. Well, that was modeled after Charles Goodnight. And his sidekick, Gus McCrae,
Yeah, you reference Lonesome Dove in the book.
Yeah,
I remember
yes, I do.
with Goodnight's
Well,
section.
I mean, that's what Lonesome Dove was. It was really based on true incidents. But it's the character, the adventure, the work ethic that those individuals had. So I put him in the book because I thought it conveyed a great message for people, particularly young people, who might read this book. Theodore Judah was another whose name you probably don't recognize.
Never heard of him.
But he was a young engineer who had an idea, a concept. And his idea was, wouldn't it be great if we had a transcontinental railroad? How do we stitch this great country of ours together? How do we civilize and develop between the Pacific coast and the cities of the East and the Atlantic coast? Came up with the idea of a transcontinental railroad. Went out and actually walked the route through the Sierras to see if it was physically possible to construct the railroad. Then he went to what was called the Big Four. They were merchants in Sacramento at the time, and convinced them to put up capital so he could start the venture. Now, these four merchants, their biggest idea, by the way, up to that point, was how could they capture the monopoly on shovels to sell to the miners who had just discovered gold in California. Not a very big idea. But in any event.
But he convinced them.
He convinced them. And then, if that wasn't enough, he went to Washington, helped convince the politicians, helped write the legislation, and helped get it passed.
And that legislation created mileage bonuses for laying track, and also, which I thought was extraordinary, the concept of land grants, that as you build track, you get federal acreage, and the federal government, ultimately millions of acres that the railroads got.
An interesting concept, so I'll talk about that. Let me finish with Theodore Judah, because not long after he was coming back to the West Coast, passing through Panama, he came down by boat, went through Panama, caught a boat coming up to the West Coast, died of yellow fever. He didn't get any of the credit for what he did at that part of his life, and then he passed away. He was forgotten. The land grant and the system that the government used was probably the first and certainly one of the best public-private partnerships, because the government put up so much money per mile built, and it varied if it was the prairie or the mountains. It was higher going through the mountains. And they gave a checkerboard of every odd section of land, 640 acres of land, 20 miles on either side of the railroad. So there was a financial incentive, and there was a land incentive. So the railroads, in order to get their capital back, because it was very expensive in those days to build a railroad, still is, they had to go out and sell the land. Sell it to farmers, to ranchers, to settlers, and so forth.
I live on a farm, and it was owned by Union Pacific.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, and in fact, there's oil and gas operations on the farm that Union Pacific, those were Union Pacific operations.
Well, I used to work for Union Pacific, and then before that, I worked for Southern Pacific, which was the western half. As you know, the railroad, Union Pacific started building from Omaha, and the Southern Pacific started on the west coast, San Francisco, coming east. And they met at Promontory Point in Utah.
I don't know where the spike was pounded into the ground and celebrated, but not every, and you wrote about not everybody was there at that celebration.
But the back, just one other point, back to that method of financing, it was quite unique at the time.
Had anything like that ever been done before?
I don't think anything like that, to the best of my knowledge, had been done, certainly not on that scale. And it was probably the largest, one of the largest construction projects ever in the world. Up to that time.
Were there some of the railroad barons, as it were, who, knowing that they got a per mile bonus or award, were there some routes that maybe were a little longer than they needed to be?
You know, some of that went on. As a matter of fact, as the two railroads approached Promontory Point in Utah, they actually built past each other.
What, like 100 miles or something?
Something like 100 miles, so they could collect their land grant fees. So they had to back up, and I assume they refunded the money, by the way. But you know, by the standards of the day, there were probably some questions about some of the tactics and techniques, I presume.
That were used. All right, I know we have to wrap up this segment. One of the things that really fascinated me, Phil, was, and I got to admit, I was really ignorant about this, was the number of railroads, companies that existed. I mean, most people today can name one or two. But over the period you wrote about, there seemed like hundreds of different companies.
There were hundreds, indeed. There were probably thousands if you counted all the short lines and so forth that were built. But gradually, those began to be rolled up and consolidated because most were very inefficient. And today, you have just a small handful of railroads, very large ones, and by the way, quite efficient and economical today.
And I want to talk about some of those efficiencies that you wrote about. We're going to take our last break here in part one. We'll be right back with Philip Anschutz.
All these individuals, not all, but most of these individuals had innovation at the very core of what they did. Back to General Palmer. He had the interesting idea at the time that people that worked for the railroad should actually own stock in it. And he gave stock to his workers.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. Find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
Join me and watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
Watch the Aaron Harper Show.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show.
I'm Reverend Jesse Jackson. Watch the Aaron Harber Show and keep hope alive.
The Aaron Harber Show may be viewed 24/7 at no charge from any location in the world at www.harbertv.com.
Welcome back to the show. This is our final segment in part one of our two-part series with Philip Anschutz. So Phil, I'd be really interested in some of the men you wrote about that you had more of an affinity to just because of your own personal experience. So who are some of your favorites?
Well, there's many favorites because I admired their business strategies and some personal things about their life. As an example, Carnegie, a great businessman, a great strategist, and very thoughtful in what he did, and very committed. But I had the most respect for him for a small essay he wrote called The Gospel of Wealth. And in that essay, it was very simply written, he talked about responsibilities of giving back. There were three principal points in his Gospel of Wealth. The first was to live a very moderate, unostentatious, low-profile life. The second was you had an obligation to take care of your loved ones, your family, and provide for them. And protect them if you could, longer term, but in a moderate way. And your third obligation was to give back to society, reinvest whatever you had been fortunate enough to have gained in this life for future generations. Another personal contact, Aaron, for me was in reading the biographies, doing the research for the book, which, as I mentioned earlier, I've had and worked on for the last 35 plus years. Some of the individuals I felt never had fulfilled or had the ability to finish their strategies for their businesses or for their industries. Perhaps they might have gone bankrupt, or perhaps they might have passed away early.
Or had an illness.
Or perhaps little details like the Sherman Antitrust Act came along and stopped their strategies. And I'm talking about railroads now. So there were 6 or 7 individuals that I liked what they were doing so well. I ended up buying, the companies they started.
And who were they?
An example would be Claude Becher. Ideal Cement was the biggest company he put together. I felt there was still a future in developing what he started out to do. Another was Fred Harvey. his company was the old Fred Harvey Company, which is now called Xanterra.
Which, of course, millions of people have visited their facilities at our national parks.
Exactly. Because there was more to do, I felt. General Palmer, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, which was headquartered here in Denver, as you probably recall. And through that, then we acquired the Southern Pacific Railroad, some other railroads, and eventually that was merged into the Union Pacific Railroad. Because General Palmer, I'm sure, had that as a strategy, but he never got there.
And you completed it for him.
Well, let's hope, perhaps. Spencer Penrose and the Broadmoor Hotel. He had great marketing ideas. He had great hospitality ideas. He never really got a chance to finish because he passed away. So that would be another example.
One of the things you mentioned was Carnegie's kind of three principles, and the one at the end about giving back to the community. I was fascinated by the variety of how these very successful businessmen gave back to the community, where some did absolutely nothing, and others literally dedicated, especially the later years of their lives, and literally their entire fortunes to making a difference in their community and the country and sometimes the world. But how do you explain that variation?
Well, let me first say, I didn't pick the individuals for this book based on whether or not they would be good role models, even by the standards.
That's obvious, by the way.
Even by the standards of the time
Right.
when they lived. I picked them because of their abilities to create positive change and long-term strategies for industries or businesses that would survive and change the American West. But in doing the work on the book, I was very pleasantly surprised to find how many of them actually were good role models. And they did give back. There was that spirit of reinvestment. And I think one of the best was the example I gave of Andrew Carnegie, because he actually wrote on the subject. And I think he undoubtedly affected other individuals and friends that he knew at the time.
I was really intrigued by the strategies, the business strategies that some of your subjects used to become successful and, in essence, do things that other business people wouldn't do that were seen as positive. I'll give you a couple of examples. One was Henry Ford, and the idea that you wrote about his concept of doubling the daily wage, giving literally a 100% increase in wage. Well, I mean, today it wouldn't sound like a lot, but going from $2.50 a day to $5 a day was an extraordinary decision on his part, yet it helped the country, it helped his business, it helped create the middle class, which drove the economy. What was your reaction when you researched and saw and first knew about that, whenever that occurred?
I thought it was surprising and at the time quite innovative, and was driven by the fact I think he was less focused on creating a middle class than he was about creating a long-term industrial plant that had the ability to manufacture and deliver cars on an assembly line basis. Another innovation, as you well know, for Henry Ford was the assembly line. But all these individuals, not all, but most of these individuals had innovation at the very core of what they did. Back to General Palmer. He had the interesting idea at the time that people that worked for the railroad should actually own stock in it. And he gave stock to his workers. Now, that wasn't done in those days, but it worked. And he had a very loyal, committed workforce because of it. But that's just two examples, and there's many examples.
And we're going to discuss more of those in part 2. But this is the end of part 1 with Philip Anschutz. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching. Make sure you watch part 2. We'll see you next time.
Please contact us. We want to hear from you. And thanks for watching.